America's Bomber Boys Who Fought the Air War Against Nazi Germany. He's also written and was historical consultant for World War II in HD, the 10-hour series on the History Channel that was narrated by Gary Sinise. And he will be speaking on Masters of the Air. I believe he also has some great news to report. I don't know where are you, Don?
Here.
Do you want me to announce it?
Sure.
Don has just signed a contract with Tom Hanks and Spielberg to do a miniseries with HBO, all the Band of Brothers, but based on his book, Masters of the Air, which he's going to talk about tonight. We have copies of his book available after in the lobby, and the book is free, but the autograph will cost $21. Don, it's yours.
Thank you. Am I wired? Okay. All right. Okay. I had planned to bring some visuals tonight, some slides and things like that about the 8th Air Force, but I'm a technological idiot, and I destroyed somehow the thumb drive, and the whole slideshow was erased from my computer. And ironically, the day before, I was talking to my buddy Dave McCullough, and I said, Dave, how come you still type with an Underwood manual typewriter? He said, because you can push one button and erase everything. Well, I did it the next day. No retrieval. So I apologize. I apologize for that. I'm also limping around a little bit. I challenged my, I should say I was challenged by my 14-year-old granddaughter to a game of racquetball, and a 100-yard dash, and a softball pitcher-catcher thing, and I've never been the same since. It was about 6 days ago. So, heard a lot about you guys from a lot of speakers who have been here, and it's wonderful to speak to an audience like this, an audience that cares. I speak to college students primarily, and some of them have to be there. Some of them enjoy being there, but some of them have to be there. But here, everyone wants to be here. And I've often thought, sitting where you're sitting, that too many lecturers drone on for 50 minutes, and then the doors open, and we have a book signing, and we leave. So I'm going to keep this relatively brief and throw out some suggestive ideas. And I'd like to draw you into the discussion, and maybe we can have a Q&A, an extended Q&A as well. Okay? And perhaps at the end of that, I can tell you a little bit about the Hank Spielberg series and where we are with that. The origin of the book. I am not a military historian, and I was a philosophy major as an undergraduate, and I took something called, by the highfalutin term, intellectual history when I went to a small Benedictine liberal arts college called St. Vincent College. And yeah, I went in my grandfather's attic. My uncle served with a big red one, and was first, he was in the D-Day landing, the first 2 minutes, furious fire, amazing he survived, 87% casualties. My father was in the 8th Air Force. My uncle flew in the Pacific. He flew the big bombers in the Pacific with Curtis LeMay, the fire raids in Japan. So we have a history of this. And like all kids, my brother and I would root around the attic and find the old chests, pull out the stuff. But it was very hard pulling the stories out of my father, out of my uncles. They didn't seem to want to talk about it. And I attribute the recent interest in this to Steve Ambrose and the way he got to Winners and that whole, crowd of Band of Brothers. and by getting the veterans to talk to one another, and then listening to them talk to each other, and then entering into the dialogue. We did a film recently, Tom Hanks and I, will be on HBO soon. It's called He Has Seen War. And it takes veterans from 1945, when they arrived home, into the 1960s. And one of the reasons we made that film is because I was standing at a book signing in New Orleans, and a kid came up to me. This is a very sad story. And I was selling the book, signing the book, the story of World War II, which was my first book on World War II. And he said to me, "That was a real war." And I said, "Well, they all are. Anytime you're shot at, if you're in Grenada or anywhere else, it's a real war." And he said, "Well, that's not what my father said." And I think this is an unusual World War II veteran. He said, "I served in Vietnam 3 years, 2 Purple Hearts." And he said that was a secondary kind of war, a B-League war. And I thought to myself, my God. He said, and I questioned him further, and he said, "Well, our guys were in good shape when we came back. High levels of post-traumatic stress disorder, drug addiction, things like this." And he said the transition that the World War II veterans went through was very smooth or easy. And it stopped me short. I thought, no, that wasn't the way it was. So we uncovered an old film called He Has Seen War that the Army produced. My brother, who's a film archivist, found the film moldering in the archives, National Archives in Washington, D.C., and showed it to me. It's a very powerful film. It's kind of like the John Huston film about combat stress. And it was never released, and this was never released. And in brief, the theme was, we have trained these men to be killers, but we haven't decompressed them. How do they become ordinary civilians? Especially those who serve long terms as infantry combat men. And the film is brutally realistic, and again, it wasn't released. So after watching that film, we gathered together all the veterans who we interviewed and premiered really for national audiences in Band of Brothers, the whole Band of Brothers crowd, and the Pacific Group, and the 2 HBO films, and we took their stories up to the present. And this is what draws me and drew me into the study of World War II, that we missed a great opportunity with the Civil War. These veterans weren't interviewed extensively after the Civil War. Stephen Crane, who wrote the great book, The Red Badge of Courage, never served, of course, in the war. He was too young. But he tells a great story, and he said he was living up on the Tappan Zee, up by the Tappan Zee in the Hudson River, and he wanted to know how war was. He wanted to know what it was like to be at the face of battle, at the point of the spear. And he went down to the local park, and he knew there were veterans down there because they were all sleeveless, and they didn't have sleeves, pinned up sleeves. They didn't have any arms, some didn't have legs. There were of the veterans who served in the Civil War, 35% were amputees. So he started to talk to them, and they said, "Well, we'll tell you about our experience. I was in Company B, and we made it to this point in Vicksburg," and then Company C said, "No, I don't want to know about that." And then he asked the key question. He said, "What does combat feel like?" And they said, "No one's ever asked us that question. What's it like to be under that kind of immense stress? Unlike any stress. Your doctor tells you, avoid stress. It kills." Well, that's what war's all about. The side that applies the most stress wins. Okay? Whether it's technological, whether it's manpower, whether it's the combination of it, they win. Okay? They break down on the other side. And after talking to these veterans, he had stories. And he could tell a story about what combat was like, secondhand. But we have the opportunity with World War II veterans to tell the story firsthand, to hear it from them. And most of my books on World War II draw very heavily on oral histories. With some historians mistrust, they say they're unreliable. I mean, where else are you going to get the story of the war? From the ground, as it were, from the kind of the infantryman's point of view, the airman's point of view, the guy, you know, behind the guns at Okinawa on a destroyer out there, you know, fighting Japanese Zeros who have turned into terror flyers, as the Germans call them, suicide bombers. You get it from guys like this. And I thought, my first book was a general history of the war. My second book was about the Pacific Theater. And then I got back to my dad's war, the Air War. And I'm not going to argue that airmen suffered inordinately, that they suffered more than Marines, or they suffered more than Army. They all suffered equally. But the war was different. It was really, really different. And don't forget, the United States, although our contribution is sometimes disparaged because the Russians took 27 million casualties, 27 million. And we suffered less than 400,000 dead, okay? But we were the only country in the world to fight the war almost on every front. We're the only country in the world to fight the war underwater, on the surface, on the ground, and in the air, okay? And we supplied the Allied forces with 90% of their munitions and 89% of the world's oil. We were an energy colossus. So we had a contribution to make. And I think the 8th Air Force especially had a unique contribution to make. And their experiences seem to be to set them aside from other airmen, not to make them braver, not to make their contribution more valuable, but to make it very, very different. They fought a unique thing. We'll never have a bomber war again. Never. We never had one before 1939, and because of missile technology, which was developed during the war by the Germans, we'll sure as hell never have another bomber war again, where you have fleets of bombers. Imagine it. I talked to people in East Anglia. I did a lot of my research in England when I was teaching at Oxford University. And these English women would tell me they'd come out of their cottages in the morning at 6 o'clock, drawn off, pulled out of their beds by the trembling of the earth, 1,400 heavy bombers flying over them, darkening the sky for 16 miles. It sometimes took them 20 minutes to pass by, and then they'd hook up with a fighter force of 1,400. And then they'd come back, and the British would go, get the Hun. And they'd fly in fleets of 800 and 900 heavy bombers with 600 convoys. And that happened every single day. And the 8th Air Force, for example, through 998 missions, and not a single mission was turned back. And what's unique about these missions is that, unlike ground warfare, there were no generals in the sky. There were no Robert E. Lees, there were no Ulysses Grants, there were no MacArthurs, there were no Pattons. Never in the history of warfare was so much authority placed in the hands of 19, 20, 21, and 22, and 25, 26-year-old kids. Never. Once you were airborne, after you got your briefing, whether you lived or died, whether you hit the target or not, was entirely up to you. You were an aerial silent. Sure, you could talk to your crew, but that's about it. You couldn't talk to the home base. So, Lee could direct the battle in the Civil War at Chancellorsville. He could move troops around, retreat, circle, none of that. The Air Force just had the bull in, and they did that at every target. Even at the end of the war, when Carl Spaatz, the commander of the 8th Air Force and the commander of all Allied bombers in World War II, told the Germans basically where the bombers were coming because he wanted to draw them up. Because by that point, we had a plane, finally, a Mustang, that could cream the Luftwaffe. And so the bombers, literally, the bomber boys, became bait. And at the time they became bait, they were told you're moving from 25 to 35 missions. That's not happy news. And that's different about that war. And there's the flak field in front of you, the sky filled with miles and miles and miles of flak. Exploding pieces of steel and iron. And so dark that it darkened the sky. And in the famous expression of the airman, so thick you could walk on it. And you couldn't take evasive action. You had to fly directly into that flak field. And the fighters left you at that point. You were alone. And imagine sitting in the plastic plexiglass front of the bomber with the navigator and the bombardier, and seeing that in front of you after you fought your way through the fires. What else made it different was there were hardly any bodies. Airmen were killed inside their planes and taken back to base. That was rare, though. 90% of the airmen who died in World War II with the 8th Air Force were blown to bits out of the sky, and they were turned into particles. And so there was no sense of closure. So you went back to the base and just empty bunks. Or there's a softball game that day. You don't have a third baseman, shortstop, left fielder, or catcher. They're gone. They're gone. The guys who died in the planes died horribly. You couldn't yell medic. There's no medics in the sky. If you're wounded severely, if you have an arm blown off or a leg blown off, they put you on the freezing floor of the plane. And remember, you're flying at 26,000 feet. In December, it's 62 degrees below zero, and the planes open to the air, the early B-17s. So there's wind blast coming through there. You put a blanket over the shivering, dying man. You put some morphine into him. You've been given, the crew's been given absolutely almost no, literally no, medical training. And you hope the kid survives. In so many cases, they wrapped these kids in parachutes and they threw them out of the plane and they hoped that the German doctors would take care of them, because there was no chance of getting back 3 hours back to England, and the guy could bleed out. Another thing about the war that always struck me that was strange, and it's different from infantry, as I said, is we're on terra firma. Air, sunlight, a beautiful day like this, it's what sustains us. In the air where they kill. If it's a clear day, a sunny day, it's a great day for hunting. For who? For the Luftwaffe. To kill the bombers. You hope for fog. You hope to be above the clouds in heavy mists. And the air kills above 10,000 feet, you can't breathe. The air war, yeah, there was an air war in World War I, but it was flown below 12,000 feet. No oxygen. You go above there, you have oxygen. But the oxygen masks are primitive. So in the fury of combat, you could be fighting the Luftwaffe coming in at you at closing speeds, a Messerschmitt, at closing speeds of 600 miles an hour. When if I'm looking at that exit, I can see, and I can't see, a bug by that exit. 1, 2, 3, he's past me. That's how fast they came in. That's why so few German planes were knocked out by aerial gunners. And in the fury of combat, you forgot things. You didn't know sometimes that you weren't pulling air because you had vomited because of air sickness, because of fear, into your mask, clogged the mask. And you weren't pulling air, and in 35, 50, 40 seconds, you pass out. 2 minutes, you're dead of anoxia, oxygen deprivation. And maybe your crew doesn't even know it. Again, in the chaos of combat, your gun jams. You're a waist gunner, sitting in an open port with the wind coming in, at 60, 65 miles an hour. You're firing, you're all wrapped up, you have an electrical suit on that sometimes worked and sometimes didn't. And your gun jams. So you pull your silk gloves off and you try to clear the jam. Well, you know what happens then. That flesh touches the steel and sticks to it. You pull away 3 layers of skin. And we didn't know all this stuff before we put these guys in the air. We knew we wanted to run a strategic bombing campaign, and we had the planes to deliver the instruments of death. We had the B-17, which was developed by 1935. We had the Liberator, the B-24, which is ready to go, 2 years later. But we didn't have air medicine. We didn't even know how to care for these guys when they suffered these kinds of diseases. And also, trauma in the air was different. An average combat man, used to say an army truck can last about 157 days, and that's about how long a guy can last in combat. And about 98% of combat guys never got to that point. They were either dead, wounded, or they broke down. In North Africa, we pulled out 36,000 guys in Tunisia for post-traumatic stress disorder. And this started to happen in the 8th Air Force. There's a different kind of post-traumatic stress disorder. You don't get that 1,000-mile stare. What you got was phobias. You saw a plane blown up. You started to worry about your wings falling off. You saw a crewman killed. Every time the plane rattled, you thought it was a machine gun fire and you were going to get killed. I talked to a gunner years ago, still alive, Sherman Small, in Connecticut. Sherman was in the tail of the B-17. In October of 1944, the Germans started to fly suicide missions against the B-17s, like the Japanese did. And they tried to crash into the tail sections, or close to the tail sections of the B-17s, and cut them in half. And then, unlike the Japanese, they would bail out and try to do it again. Small's plane was cut in half. He was in the tail section. He dropped to earth 3 miles. Now, what happens to a man when he drops to earth 3 miles? One airman asked me that question. He said, I used to think about that. When do you die? 1 mile? 2 miles? You die of shock right away? Or, Jesus, my God, don't you die till you hit the ground? But in any event, Sherman tried to punch his way out. He had a parachute on of the tail section, and he couldn't get out. And miraculously, he survived. He survived the drop. And taken to a medical facility? Yeah. Getting checked out? Yeah. The next day, he was flying in a B-17 in Bergsburg, in the tail section. And he broke down. And I said, how did it happen, Sherman? He said, I froze up like a Wisconsin log in January. I just couldn't do anything. I was immobile. He said, up to that point, the only way I could survive was pretending that this world war that I was in, this air war, this air fight was a movie. And I was an actor, Sherman Small. This really wasn't happening to me. He said, well, once I went down, I knew it was happening to me. And I was never the same after that. He went to Don Carlos Hospital in Florida after the war, and he was there for 5 years. But he finally pulled out of it by 51. And the destructiveness of this war, this air war, was incredible. I mean, World War II is the most destructive event in human history. The 160 million, now we're talking about 180 almost, people died in World War II, the greatest catastrophe in human history. 8th Air Force, 26,000 dead. Now put that in perspective. It's not a big unit. They had about 250,000 guys, but that includes ground crew, air traffic controllers, mechanics, etc. Flyers, about 100,000. 26,000 of those guys were dead. Now, put it in another frame. In the entire Pacific War, from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, the Marine Corps suffered 19,600 dead. So the 8th Air Force, almost 7,000 more dead in their air battle. And that doesn't include the wounded, and it doesn't include the 36,000 POWs, who at the end of the war were all collected in German prisons in the Eastern Reich and had to march, forced marches. Not many people know about these. We're going to do them in the film. 110, 111 days off, marching from Zabin, Poland, to Moosburg. I was just in Moosburg, 2 weeks ago, to a prison camp in Moosburg. And to walk, this is during the war, not after the war, and to walk through the Nazi towns that you bombed and past the people whose relatives you killed. Incredible. Incredible. And we'll never know. We hear all about the Bataan Death March, and we have a good idea of how many people died in that, but we'll never know how many people died in these forced marches at the end of the war. If you serve with the 8th Air Force, you have a 1 in 4 chance in the early war of surviving your 25 missions. Those are worse odds than Russian roulette. 77% of the men who flew with the 8th Air Force were casualties. 77%. So Harrison Salisbury for the New York Times put it well. He said, to be a member of the 8th Air Force, and he said this during the war, was to hold a ticket to a funeral, your own. And so these are the kinds of pressures. And finally, the other real difference here is this is intermittent war. The infantrymen were usually broken down by unremitting, steady, bloody, incessant combat. God help them, you know, the way they had to fight. These air crews could be flying over Berlin at noon and be back in London at 11 o'clock in a pub with the girl of their dreams. And they could return to clean sheets and good food. And in the pubs, English women. But the intermittent nature of the war, the fly Monday, try to fly Tuesday, socked in with weather. Try to fly Wednesday, socked in with weather. Not gonna die today. Gotta get those 25 missions in. Later the 35. Fly Thursday. 17 of our crew knocked out of the air. Featured character in our film is going to be Rosie Rosenthal, a real character, one of my very best friends, and he died not too long ago, served with the 100th Bomb Group for 51 missions. Rosie flew a mission to Munster with the 100th Bomb Group. It's the only plane to return. This was his third air battle of the war. He was a young lawyer 6 months before this, practicing on Wall Street. And now he's flying B-17s into the heart of the Reich. And the 8th is the first group to take the war directly to Hitler's doorstep. Not an infantryman steps across the Rhine until 45. And almost every prisoner up to that point is an airman, British or American, every Allied prisoner, except those captured in North Africa and in Italy. So it's a very different kind of war, and that was one of it was the pulling power of that drew me into this thing. And another thing, and finally, and I'll open this up for questions. I had always heard that the air war didn't do any good, that the Nazis were still producing enormous amounts of munitions, tanks, and planes at the end of the war. And hence that this air war was ineffective. And the more I looked at the record, I read all 180, there's 189 volumes of the Strategic Bombing Survey, which was produced by the United States to assess the damage we had inflicted upon Germany. And we want to know, we're not trying to pump up, the Air Force was great at pumping up statistics. They had the greatest propaganda department next to the Marines. And they were great, you know, and they had Clark Gable, they had Jimmy Stewart, they had the actors, you know, the whole thing. So, but they really wanted to get the truth because they really thought the war with Japan would last until 48. Golden Gate by 48. That's what all the Marines were saying in the Pacific. We know now what they did in 45. How the hell did they know? It's like a guy, I once asked the stupidest question I ever asked anybody. It was Johnny Morris, the gunner. I said, Johnny, how come you guys bombed Dresden so close to the end of the war? He says, Jesus Christ, how do we know it was the end of the war? He said, I thought it helped to end the war. I said, okay, let's re-dive. Reading the volumes, it becomes very clear that the airmen didn't win World War II. It's like Trident's forceps, the three. It's Navy, it's infantry, Marine, it's air. It's a combined effort, you know, threefold. But here's what the 8th and the Allied Air Force did. The bombing at first was abysmally ineffective. We were trying to bomb U-boat facilities in Brittany. Our bombs were bouncing off these reinforced concrete U-boat sub-bases, 6 feet thick, like ping pong balls. And all we were doing is bombing French civilians that the Germans had as forced laborers. And this lasted for a long time, and we were taking, because I said, staggering casualties. These guys, the early guys, were the guinea pigs. They're the ones who suffered the most. The Bob Morgans. And don't forget, not a single, all you had to do, you had to fly 25 missions. They flew the first one on August 15th, 1942. Nobody got to 25 until the end of May. Everybody who tried before that was dead. So, but then, once we get the fighter force in there, once we get powerful Thunderbolts with extra tanks called Tokyo tanks that you have on your wings, and we could reach deep targets, deep into the Reich, like Berlin, the Big B. And then the Mustang arrives. It helped to save the air war. It becomes operational at the end of 44, just in time for D-Day, and we're worried, the countdown's on. If we can't knock the Luftwaffe out of the sky by late May, early June, when the D-Day invasion is planned, and nobody knew it was going to be on the day it was, if we didn't knock the Luftwaffe out of the sky, nobody could land on those beaches. I stood there on those beaches, above those beaches, with Steve Ambrose, my old buddy, and Tom Brokaw, and Steve was trying to explain the battle, and he knew it so well, to Tom. And he was talking about who was where and where and where. And I just interjected at one point. I said, Steve, you got to remember who wasn't here. The U-boats weren't there. They had been knocked out the previous May. Black May, the Germans called it, out of the Central Atlantic. If they'd been there, it could have been a massacre. But it certainly would have been a massacre if the German Air Force had been there. But they weren't. And we weren't sure. We sent scout planes ahead to be absolutely sure. They had been knocked out in a furious succession of air battles that were fought between February of 44 and almost to the eve of D-Day. When we really, went mano-a-mano, it was almost hand-to-hand combat in the air. And in that battle, we knocked out the German Air Force. They had planes. They still had planes. But they didn't have two things. They didn't have pilots. And later, when we started to hit their oil facilities, by the following autumn, late autumn, they don't have any fuel. They don't even have diesel fuel to put their jets in the air. They could put their jets in the air for 45 seconds. That was all. So we put an air cap over there, let them fly around for 45 seconds and blow their jet up. And so D-Day is possible because of that. Sacrifice. What kind of sacrifice am I talking about? 18,600 airmen died in the run-up to D-Day. Now, the total casualties, dead, wounded, missing on D-Day are just below 10,000. There should be a monument to these guys in that Omaha cemetery. And there isn't, because they made this possible. They made it possible. And then, as I said, they started to hit petrol, the synthetic oil factories that the Germans were manufacturing oil with, and the rail system. And Germany depended upon oil for its military, depended upon oil to move tanks, munitions, planes, and the whole economy was a coal economy. And so they ran their steel mills. And we hit their trains that carried coal to the steel mills instead of hitting the steel mills themselves, and we create a coal famine. So as one German general put it in a report to the U.S. bombing circuit, we couldn't move. We couldn't fly. And it was vividly demonstrated at the Battle of the Bulge when they made that big surprise punch and then were pushed back. They were never the same again. So the Air Force had a contribution to make. And they made it, with a tremendous sacrifice. And one story really stands out for me about this whole thing, about how it's a little risque, but it's funny. Because so many of these guys who suffered and died didn't pity themselves. They could joke about it. They could talk about the war. They could bring some humor to the situation. I have a friend named Lou Lovsky, and Lou's going to be a character in our film. And Lou was a navigator. First mission, his bomber gets blown out of the sky. And Lou, who is Jewish, is floating in a parachute down onto Nuremberg. That's where it all started with the Nazis and the Germans. And he's thinking to himself, In about 15 to 25 seconds, I'm going to be captured or killed. There's no question about it. And then I said, what were your thoughts at that point, Lou? And by the way, as I was interviewing him, 88 years old, he was doing push-ups on the floor of the hotel. But anyway, I stopped. And Lou said, well, what I was thinking of, he said, was what I did before the mission. I said, well, what'd you do? He said, well, we're all going to go to London. And he said, and we got this big batch of contraceptives. And he said, I was a virgin. And he said, I stuffed my uniform, my dress uniforms, with about 100 of these condoms. And he said, and I knew if I was killed or captured, they'd go in, they'd strip my bed immediately, the day I didn't return, and they'd send the chest back to my mom with my uniform. She'd think I was some kind of pervert. And he said, holy hell, he said, I was a virgin. And he said, you know, Lou, you know, the good little Jewish kid, you know? And he said, that was what scared me more than the nonsense. Thank you.
Every one of these speakers is amazing because this came right on the heels of last month's speaker who was a tailgunner in P-17. So I'm sure that this put a little bit more in perspective of what he experienced. So everyone we hear, be it a historian or a participant in the war, adds another patch to the tapestry that we're learning. And so thank you very much for
I appreciate being here.
I didn't know if we're going to hear about how many planes there were, how many bombs they dropped, how many statistics you could spiel out of this, but putting the human touch on it adds an awful lot to it, and I think that's, as you said earlier.
I can't even keep my golf score, you know?
What's that?
Sometimes in golf, I said I can't even keep my golf score.
Anyway, we as we always do, we have questions and answers, but I'd like to have a little treat for you here.
Oh.
What do you suppose it would be like to have been a participant as a kind of like a wide receiver receiving the gifts of the Allied bombers? I'm going to answer the question for you by saying we have a person in this room with whom I served in the airborne just a little over 50 years ago. Jesus, I thought. Who happened to have been there at the time. And maybe, if Theo, if you're around, there he is. Would you give us a comment or two about what you recall as a young lad in Germany and seeing what you saw, hearing what you heard, thought what you thought? This is Theo Knack. He came over from New Jersey just to be with us.
He's not old enough.
Thank you. Where do you ever see
He doesn't even look 60 years old.
Thank you, I like you. This is the first time I let myself listen to the air raids. All this time I could never watch war films, even though I served as a paratrooper. And I grew up as a boy being air raided in the city of Mannheim. And it started out every once in a while. Then they came every night. And then they came day and night. And we would get up in the morning and you'd go out on the street and there would be more homes knocked out. But I never pictured the men in those bombers. To me, they were airplanes and bombs. I never pictured all that went on inside of the airplane. All I know is what went on below. And I feel very, very fortunate not to have been killed. We left the city of Mannheim when there was 2 houses left on our street. And then went out to the country, and the countryside, the farm towns were not bombed as much. Every once in a while they had an extra bomb that it didn't drop someplace else. But when air raids came, we were on a code on the radio, knew which way they were going, and you were hoping they weren't coming for you. And then we would go out and you look out on the street, and And if the airplane was on top of you, you knew they weren't bombing you, but they couldn't hit you by then. But you knew if they were opening the bomb base, they weren't far to go before they were going to dump it. And all of the bombing that went on to Stuttgart, Heilbronn, Göppingen, Mannheim was where I lived. And it was scary. My brother would claw the wall in the basement till his fingers bled during the air raids. But I never had any ill feelings towards the airmen. They were soldiers like our soldiers. And then we were just so glad when the Americans came and it was all over with. Americans were a relief. They didn't harass us, they didn't hurt us, they fed us. And then came the French for a month. And they had none themselves. And then the Americans come back and lucky us. America, I came over here and I joined the opposite side. I became American paratrooper, served, and proud to be American, became a citizen in 1958, Bowling Green, Kentucky, of all places. And this is the first time I listened to what you had to say. And I hope I don't start with the nightmares, because my wife used to wake me up at night. Wake up, and I would have nightmares about air raids and wars. It was all caused by the Germans, so I don't blame nobody. But as a kid, it's all the same. It's horrible. And I hate war. No matter where we go, I don't like it. And I hope we as a country don't do any more of it. Kirk, you put me on the spot. Kirk just reminded me of something, lies I used to tell him. One night, the ground shook. Nothing really exploded. Next morning, there was the bomb that didn't explode. It looked like what they dig out of the gas station fuel tank. I'm sure as a kid it was no bigger than it was, but it was big. And when they lifted it up, we kids stood around, we watched. And the rumor had it did not have a detonator in it. And it was always that some airman, in his kindness or whatever, did not install a detonator. And I always wondered if it's true that those bombs were armed in flight rather than when they were loaded. Because if that thing had gone off, I couldn't be telling you these lies here. Thank you.
Well, it's interesting that you brought that up, because what I tried to do in my research and in my book is tell the air war from two perspectives, from the men in the planes and from those under the bombs, those who bombed. And there's two sets of victims in the air war. I mean, 600,000 Germans were killed as a result of a live bombing. An entire city, 61 German cities, were turned to cinder and ash. But what strikes me is a lot of innocent people were killed too. But I do believe that the Nazis, drew it on themselves, and the people who supported them. But what struck me particularly when we were talking is, and I try to explain this in the book, there's an eerie similarity between flying in a B-17 through a flak field. And that's how most airmen were killed at the end of the war, when we knocked the Luftwaffe out. Guys would tell me, we could yell 12 o'clock high, 11 o'clock high, everybody communicated in the plane. But all of a sudden, when there's no German Air Force, we're flying through the flak field, and whether we lived or died depended on the luck, sheer luck. And he just sat there. He said, it was like have a burglar come in the house and strap you to a chair and put a shotgun in your face and say, I might kill you and I might not. You just didn't know. Well, people on the ground had the same kind of feeling. I mean, they just didn't know when a stream of bombs was going to land in their neighborhood. And whether they lived or died, they couldn't do anything about it, and neither could the airmen. They're both utterly helpless. And when they died, it was just, again, bad Lady Fortune did it to them. And they just happened to be at that spot. And the airmen the same way. It is the ultimate tragedy of war. And I think, if you could, war's bad. I agree with everything you said about war. But the interesting thing about war is the only way you can prosecute a war successfully is if you have two things, love and leadership. Great leadership by combat leaders, and also love, the kind of love that men feel for each other, an informed band of brothers in the sky and on the ground. So that there is, like, I come, and my wife does, from a family of coal miners and places like Williamsburg. And that's how miners were underground. An injury to one, an injury to all, and we stick together. And this is what holds men together in an air war. There's a true story, and it's a very powerful story, of in B-17, the hydraulics went out on the plane, and the ball turret gunner was under the plane. He's in there like the embryo in the egg, with his legs up in the air and things like that. It's cold, and they couldn't extricate himself there. They couldn't get him out. There's a manual way to get him out, but that had stuck too, that had jammed. So the pilot said the plane's crippled and we're going down, so he pulled the bailout button, and everybody bails out, but 3 gunners. And the pilot said to him before he bailed out, so he's a witness to this. He said, "What's going on?" He said, "We made a pact that if we ever got in trouble, we'd stick together." And the plane crashed, and all 4 of those guys died. The guy and the turret and the 3 other guys. They had that contact. And it's like William Wyler, who made Memphis Belle, said, returning from war, he said it was like an escape from reality to return from war. Because in warfare, there was so much sharing. There was so little concern about material things. There was so much sacrifice. And then when it was all over, why did that stuff disappear? He said, that should have been the reality. And your thoughts, your very powerful story, really, made me think about those kinds of things.
You alluded you or somewhere that I read that in the bomb, of all the bombers, the Americans were the most discerning on the targets that they.
Well, yeah, they.
Not military targets so much as industrial targets, something like that, to save lives, as opposed to.
Well, not so much to save lives. I mean,
Spare lives, you say.
not even to spare lives, I wouldn't say. We had a top secret instrument, as you all know, called the Norden bomb sight. And the mythology about it was that it would, it was so accurate you could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. Well, you might be able to hit a sand target out on the Utah Flats on a clear sunny day in 1941, before Pearl Harbor. But when you go into the flag field, you're with fighters, your nerves are on edge, and you're looking into that little primitive computer and trying to sight the targets. It's very hard to target. I think precision bombing is an oxymoron. We were more precise in our bombing because, not so much that we wanted to save lives, but we really believed that, as opposed to the British, that killing industries was more important for ending the war than killing people. The British went at it that if you killed an industrial worker in his home, where he's an easier target, because a lot of factories had flat towers that were like skyscrapers, 19, 20 stories high, with guns and things like that could fit 20, 25,000 people, and one was still standing in Berlin. And so if you hit these kinds of targets successfully, the 8th Air Force figured if you could hit oil, if you could hit ball bearing factories, if you could hit marshalling yards, not trains on the tracks, but where trains gather in big rail facilities, you can disable the German war machine. The British tried that, but they were unsuccessful, and they took a lot of casualties, and their bombers didn't have 11 machine guns like our bombers. They didn't fly in tight formations. They didn't fly as high as the B-17, even though the Lancaster they could have. And they took staggering casualties, and they couldn't see the targets, so they started to fly at night. And when you fly at night with primitive navigation equipment, all you can see the demarcation between water and land, and maybe you follow a river to Hamburg, you see the lights of the city, and you unload. They got more accurate toward the end of the war as they developed, you know, of course the British were the first to develop radar, but they also developed guiding devices for bombers as well as the bombs. But by and large, they were interested in incinerating cities and killing workers in their homes. And we were interested in killing industries rather than workers, but there was a lot of collateral damage as well on those, you know, on our side also. But intent, I always say, well, does that mean intent doesn't matter? I think intent does matter. If I'm a German and I'm in the city and I know that the Americans are coming over and they're intent on hitting the dockyards and the submarine facilities, I'm still scared because they could miss and hit me. But if I know the British are coming in and their intent is to annihilate an entire city, I'm really worried. So I think intent does matter.
Anybody got any questions?
When is the miniseries supposed to come out?
Say-
I said, when is the miniseries supposed to be published?
Well, it'll run for an entire television season, so we produce 10 shows, and it probably will take a couple years we're writing a master script right now. We have script writers. Spielberg and Hanks are overseeing the operation. We're using my book, we're using other information that we have. And then how this is done is, if you film them one at a time, it would take forever. But if we do a master script, which we're doing now, then we know who the major characters are, what the major incidents are, and what the story is. Then we can, when we'll hire one producer and 2 script writers for 2 episodes. So there's teams of 5, and they do these things simultaneously. But now that they have the master script, they know where the story's going, where the handoffs take place. So if you got episodes 5 and 6, you knew from the master script what happened in the first couple episodes and who you're handing it off to and what's going to happen later. So that speeds the process along a little bit. But even having said that, it does take a while. And our major decision right now is how to create aerial combat. And you can use computer technology. You can do what they did with William Wyler's daughter made a film called Memphis Belle, also a Hollywood film starring Ben Affleck, and not many people have seen it. It's not there. But they actually used B-17s, and they used some Mustangs too. Funny story involved with that. Catherine was telling me that they called up everybody that had a Mustang, including Jay Leno, who had 2, and they said, bring them here, you know, we can use them. Most of the guys brought their planes. And then they said, thank you, thank you, thank you. You know, we're going to put these 20-year-old kids in these planes and fly them. I said, no 20-year-old kids fly in my plane. So they had these geezers flying them, so that, okay, bring out the dye, paint the hair, paint the mustache. They wouldn't. They said, we're taking our Mustangs home unless we can fly them. So I don't know if we're going to run into that problem or not, but we have that problem. Yeah. So I'd say 2 years. Hopefully not as long, but it took, to do the Pacific, give you an idea, to do the Pacific, it cost $190 million. It's the most expensive show in the history of television. This will cost $100 million more. It'll be the most expensive show in the history of television by far. So we've already budgeted, HBO budgeted already. So, you know, we have a lot of money to do this thing. Question, hopefully we do it right.
Don, we have a question back here, but before we do have several World War II veterans in the house for your acknowledgement. Would they please raise their hands? You see them wearing their hats.
What number do you believe is most accurate for total number of deaths worldwide in World War II?
I used to think 55 million, but since the Russian archives have been open, we're finding more about Poland as well. See, you know, proportion to population, Poland suffered more in World War II than any country in the world, and Yugoslavia was third. And they had been communist countries, but you know, since the fall of the Iron Curtain, we now can get into those archives with limited access. But I would push the number up to about 65 million. About, you know, that's would be my guess. I think the person who knows most about this and has studied it most closely is a historian named Gerhard Weinberg, who's on our advisory board of the National World War II Museum, where I serve as a trustee. And Gerhard is revising his magnum opus on World War II. And he's come up with, he said he's counted it on the basis of recent statistics, about 65 million. Some cities it goes down. I mean, people were talking about Dresden, 100,000. Basically, the mayor of Dresden has conducted an extensive study, and about 28, maybe 30,000 people were killed in Dresden. Still an awful lot. As I said before, about 60,000 Germans, close to 500,000 Japanese, which would include Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that's in a very short period of time. That is really between January and August of 45. And more square miles of Tokyo, for example, was destroyed than Berlin, even though Berlin was hit far, you know, more. There were many more missions flown that way. But we're using firebombs. We cross a moral divide when we go into the war with Japan, and where we're not using firebombs. I think we would have used firebombs in Germany, and we were planning to do this. We had, out on the Utah Flats, they built 2 cities, and they had a German architect come in and design a complete tower block apartment complex in Berlin, and then built what he called a paper city, a block of houses in Tokyo, and we bombed them incessantly with incendiaries. More powerful incendiaries, fire sticks, they called them, than the British were using. And so we would have used firebombs on Germany, and if Germany had continued the war, we certainly would have extended the airfields in England, sent the B-29s over there, and we'd have turned Germany into a parking lot. And it would have been awful for everybody. But that was the, you know, the thing about this war is there's no peace treaty like at the end of World War I. We just walked all over Germany and we annihilated 59 Japanese cities. And then they surrender. So in both cases, in both theaters, we're fighting an enemy that won't surrender. And leaders who refuse to surrender. So how do you know, what's victory then? Well, victory becomes total annihilation. That's why guys on Okinawa were so scared, because they had fought the Japanese and they experienced the kamikaze raids in Mas. They had started a little earlier in the Philippines, but there were also kamikaze submarines, there were kamikaze swimmers, there were kamikaze charges using human shields. And so every one of these guys has this feeling that this is a nation that will send their 100 million fighting to the death. They're training with bamboo spears. The emperor is telling them to swim under the boats, under the landing boats with bombs and explode them like that. And unlike Normandy, the Japanese were saving 500 kamikaze fighters. They were in bad shape, but that didn't matter. They were going to die anyway, the plane and the pilot. And they were going to crash into the landing boats, into the Higgins boats as they landed. So that would have been really terrible. But this is one thing about bombing. As awful as it was, it did terminate the thing. And I think in both countries, it left a searing lesson on the minds of people. I talked to a German woman in Saxony near Dresden, and she said, nobody believed after the war, when the pictures started to come out, when Eisenhower visited the concentration camps and forced the people of places where the camps were held to walk through the camps and see for themselves what was happening, you know, under their own eyes. And she said people didn't believe and thought it was propaganda, but she said, I'll tell you what was impressive. When your Air Force at the end of the war flew over our little village, and they weren't bombing it, they were on their way to Berlin, and it took them 18 minutes to fly over, and they flew over in silver planes, not camouflaged brown planes. And there wasn't a single German plane to combat them. And Hitler had always said the Luftwaffe will protect you, or the Fuhrer will protect you. And that cut the tide. It doesn't turn someone who's anti-Semitic into someone who, you know, wants to be friends with Jewish people. It doesn't turn a person who believed that Germany was right to start the war into someone that, you know, believes differently at the end of the war. But it does cut the tide between the people and Hitler and the party. The party couldn't stop what was happening. And the emperor couldn't stop what was happening in his own city. He's sitting in Tokyo. And that's why he is a war criminal, Hirohito. He should have been hanged at the end of the war. And he was sitting in his own city that was just being incinerated. Okay, and he's in one of the only bomb shelters there. He's seeing what his continuation of the war, the suffering, he's bringing on his own people. And we should have never, I don't think, you know, MacArthur should have never put him up as a token ruler of Japan after the war. He should have been tried as a war criminal and suffered the fate of the German war criminals who were properly hanged.
That was very interesting, Doctor. I happened to meet a historian you're probably familiar with, Roger Freeman.
Yeah, I know Roger. Well done, Roger, the late Roger Freeman.
Yeah, well, you know, he was the authority, if you will, on the 8th Air Force.
Oh, he collected so much documentation. He wrote 3 big books about munitions. He cataloged all the missions. He grew up in England. As a kid, he watched the raids being taken place and turned his entire life over to the study of the 8th Air Force. And I'm also a trustee of the 8th Air Force Library in Savannah. We renamed our library the Roger Freeman Library. Great guy.
Yeah, I was able to have an interesting conversation with him, and I hope in your film you bring out the role that the ground crew did. It was not brought out in the remake of Memphis Belle, and when you talk to any of these guys that were, especially the pilots, and they tell you how much they relied on them, and the conditions that these guys worked all through the night in cold. They weren't working inside of warm, hangars like the Air Force has today. It was pretty nasty, and the same for the guys on the ground. The fighters. The other thing is, and he points this out, and he touched on it, this idea of precision bombing. A lot of people think that every B-17, B-24 had a Norden bomb sight in it. You know, it's that lead bombardier, and that they bomb the Americans. You know, not every plane is aiming. They bomb on the lead plane. But this is where you have your heroes, your leadership in the air. Because when that lead plane goes down, right? I mean, you know the stories of the various groups and squadrons that another guy assumes that role and takes them in. For instance, the bombing of Felicity. Of course, that's the 15th Air Force, but the Medal of Honor.
There were 2 groups in that as well. Yeah.
But I also studied the Luftwaffe, and I met with a lot of those, interviewed the pilots, and particularly the ones that went after the bomber force, because the unit I was looking at was primarily Yakashado II, which was when they protected the sub-pens. And were you do anything on the 17th of April, 45? Yeah, that's the ramming mission. Are you going to do something on that one?
Me?
No, it will be included in the...
Yeah.
Because I think there you see the whole fertility that you were expressing here, of where that all led to.
Yeah. And we have a character, Ken Lemons, who is a mechanic, And Ken is no longer with us, but Ken wrote an autobiography. And his entire family has been studiously collecting all the information about him, his diaries and everything. He's going to be a major character in the film. The mechanic.
Okay, children, school's about out.
Thanks.
Tom, be sitting outside. I'm sure we'd love to have his autograph in one of his books.
They took the rocket plane.
And so that's what these guys were doing. And they had that's crazy. Canadians.
One of the magazines was the B-26, that got flak bait, and that was 200.
Yeah, I got that somewhere.
This is the
Was that, I think, after
World War II last year.
B-26.
I thought you might want that.
Yeah, thank you.
presidential citation.
Fake years.
Mm-hmm.
And then
No, thanks so much.
Yeah, they were in Ceylon, France. Yeah, 20-some bases between North Africa and Nigeria.
Yeah, they flew off a lot of dirt tubes.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Change that.
Yes, it is.
How it works. Full children.
I don't know. Wait a minute, let me get my book over here.
It would have been April.
Yeah, I'll look it up.
They took that picture, the fallen in 79 with the Rupert House. That's it. I think that was from Edwards Air Force.
Really? 29.
Yeah, that's the one they packed
You know what? I think it's been 3 years now. Yeah. It was the first year after House took over, and it would have been at the end of the freshman year, so that was the end of the